Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 7, Black Lion Dancing. Black Lion Dancing.
Karui lavi karupikan kamnata, said Karui. Piecora laughed with her mouth full of cooked rabbit, and then Karui laughed at Piecora. That is why I call you Karui, my dear friend, Piecora said. Then she looked at Serpendis, saying, I learned the language of the Banwa when I was a child, but I was never good at it. Karui says I still speak like a child, and it amuses her. Watch. She then faced Karui and said, Tayavuchetu enagworu muti, muti, and they both exploded in uncontrollable laughter. Hero chittered above them, perched on one of the many suspended skulls hanging on vines that stretched across the domed ceiling of the tree chamber. The laughter subsided into giggling when Piecora said to her slowly, as if mockingly teaching her low Canonian common, Listen to me. I said, I wish you, or for you, to feed me a cabbage. She then looked at Serpendis as if seeking approval. Serpendis responded with a sarcastically serious hand gesture of approval, furrowing his brow and bending the corners of his mouth all the way down to punctuate the effect. That is what I said, Piecora insisted. Karui shook her head, lifting a finger like a tutor correcting a student. You say, not I wish, but please. Please. Enagworu, feed. Taya, muti. And they erupted in laughter again. Something about muti gets them every time, Serpendis thought to himself, chuckling and wheezing. He also noted that he might be picking up a little bit of her language, for he could understand a few of her words just then. They were all seated together on the floor of the chamber, eating cooked rabbit and spiced plants that both Piecora and Karui collaborated in making. Serpendis had to admit that despite its small portions when compared to Canonian standards, it was one of the most uniquely flavorful and satisfying meals he ever had. He doubted he would ever find its equal in Cannonia. They also drank a clear liquid that Piecora explained was a fermented root wine that Karui learned how to make here, and this was her first batch. To Serpendis, it smelled like muscle relaxant and tasted like sun-baked vinegar, so he barely had any of it. As a rule, he only enjoyed sipping specific Enegradan wines while in the company of his contemporaries. He never indulged in heavy drinking or carousing, but he welcomed the lightened mood here that the pungent root wine brought all of them tonight. I see you have a deep friendship, the two of you. How did that come about? Asked Serpendis. My family lives on the east side of Siena, far from Telemark, our city. We don't have borders like you bricklayers in Cannonia, but we have ranges of patrols. My father, Bjorganen, used to take me on patrols that went even further out when the Banwa migration brought them near to our lands. He is friends with the Banwa, as are many others who patrol with him, and I would always play with this one. She and I would go off wandering and get yelled at when they had to come find us. This went on for much of our childhood until our later years, when we became cursed with adulthood and making decisions of our own. Piecora's tone became sober then. The Banwa have this tradition. When a child becomes an adult, they leave the Banwa lands to discover their kindred animal spirit. It is their spirit journey. They go away and wander in the world until they finally meet their companion's spirit. Sometimes they never return. Such was the case with Karui. It has been at least 10 summers since I last saw my friend. Piecora said something to Karui in what Serpendis now understood as Banwarese, a distant capillary of Elven, and Karui responded with puzzlement. The two had an exchange in which it seemed they couldn't agree on something. After several trades back and forth, Piecora looked at Serpendis and said, She says she has only been here for less than a week. She insists that she just arrived and is still finding her footing here. But I tell you, it was over 10 years ago. Then it is true. What you said, Serpendis asked slowly. The druid stones, that we have passed into some other world, not aligned with our own? Piecora took another large bite of rabbit and spoke with her mouth full. Yes, according to Karui, we are in the Fey realm, a mirror world that coexists with our own, yet apart from it. I don't quite understand it, but druids do. Something for Tukurai to answer, I guess. He is our hermit, a powerful druid that we seek once a year on pilgrimage, and Sienians follow his wisdom and guidance. He would definitely know of this place, and probably more. What if we just jumped back into the pond that we came in through? Asked Serpendis. Piecora shook her head. No, apparently that would be very bad. We passed through a druid pool. I recognize those from the stories. These are holes between worlds. Karui says that only those who can navigate the crossing can safely travel between them, and, again, I don't fully understand any of it. But apparently both time and place are involved. If we were to jump into the pond and follow it down, without proper navigation, we would have no idea where we would arrive or when. Karui says the narrow space between worlds is a rushing river of both time and place that flows backward and forward, up and down, in and out, and all points between. Without the power or the tools to navigate the crossing, you could arrive anywhere and any time. I was very lucky to grab the rope when I dove in after you, that rope around your neck. It connected me to you, and both Hiero and I were able to follow you to exactly this place and time in the Fey world. If I hadn't done that, she shrugged her shoulders and took another bite. Reaching deep into his own knowledge and speculations of the world, some of this sounded familiar to Serpendis. There are elves who live within Kananaya's borders, and some just beyond, he began, and I've met a few of them as they pass through Coast Haven. The ones from Amedia of the Blue Moors, just outside of Kananaya's western border, speak of a druid circle there called the Mirror of Dawn. Depending on who you spoke to, whether the illiterate commoner or the academic scholar, there seems to be some belief that druids or the druidic community, or sometimes I've even heard it called the druidic network, are linked somehow by these circles and these pools. They can travel great distances within an instant, and thus they stay ever connected with each other. They can pass along information and meet wherever and whenever they need to. Some even say they secretly control the entire world in this way. But these notions are pure fantasy to many Canonians, except perhaps to those who know things but remain hidden or live secretly. He shook his head in wonder. It is all above me and my feeble mind, he said, taking an actual sip of the sour root wine, grimacing as it burned down his throat. I'm just a merchant. But they aren't all elves, Piecora said. The hermit, who we call Tukurai, is one such druid, and he's simply a man, a very old man, even older than you. She pointed a grizzled bone at him. He is one of the oldest people in the world. I don't know. I've been around a long time, Serpendis responded in mock soberness. Your hermit is known to us, by the way. Ancient indeed he is, even by my count. He rolled his eyes, maintaining the friendly mockery. We have our own name for him, Lacranus. He's been to our lands before, many times in fact, according to our books. Are you certain he is just one man? Or is he something else who wears such a guise? Or perhaps he is many people. Generations of men who have performed the role over time, passing their part down to the next one, over and over to present day. This is something I've heard scholars debating, over a game of Senzadi, sometimes in Coast Haven's open markets. Oh, all of that could be true, Piecora said. Impossible for me to know. I have never met him, as I have never been to pilgrimage." "Isn't it required among your people to see the hermit?" Serpentis asked. "Not officially, but it is expected," she replied. "It is proper to go on pilgrimage at least once in one's life. It is in our blood to go to him, as if we are drawn to him. Something compels us, despite how long and dangerous the journey is. The way is south, no wild lands, so at least the lands never change, and the paths are the same with each trip. But still there are dangers, and the trek is weeks long. He wishes to see each one of us at least once in our lives, as if he directly knows who each one of us are. I have no idea when or if I shall go on pilgrimage to see the hermit. Ever since finding Hiero, I no longer feel the obligation. I became free from it, and I don't think that makes Tkurai very happy." She shrugged while taking another bite of cooked rabbit. The tone of her voice echoed a resignation to some fate that she wasn't comfortable with. She seemed conflicted by something, and Serpentis couldn't tell if what bothered her was the nature of the hermit's relationship with Sienia or her freedom from it since finding Hiero. Piecora looked over at Karui before continuing. "When she never returned all those years ago, I went out on my own to find her. It was over a month that I was on my own, searching the lands around Sienia and Banwa for my childhood friend. When you are away from people for that long, you begin to change a little. You either miss that fellowship and yearn to be reconnected with people, or you discover the resignation within yourself of being alone. And if it's the latter, you then realize how hard it was all along to be tethered by the social expectations of others." She continued after a few moments of thinking. "One night, I dreamed I floated in a black, waveless sea without any sounds except for my own breathing, and my ears filled with my own steady pulse. There was no moon, and the stars overhead were like pinpricks in a black curtain. Their placement was strange, and I couldn't determine where I was or what season it was, based on their arrangement. I felt hollow on the inside, empty, soulless, and within my dream I closed my eyes and slept while drifting in that silent sea, resigned to my solitude, accepting it as mine. It defined me. But strangely, while I slept inside my dream, I lingered above myself, watching my body floating within the endless black sea. How is that possible? How could I be outside of myself, when all I know of me is what I see from behind these eyes, and how others react to me?" She gestured with her hands up and down around her head and body, as if trying to capture and convey the totality of her self-concept for Serpentis. How does one even know of one's own existence or worth to themselves without being reflected in a response from another? She posed her hands in front of her, palms forward, and fingers splayed out, as if studying them. "This is all I know about me. These two hands, my arms, my legs. I look down and I see my body. I only know what exists before me and that which responds to me. I cannot see me." There was a long pause while Serpentis measured her words against his own academic studies. He read several books held within the vast vaults of the Dolgothaden Temple Library, written on the concepts of self and self-concept, and yet hearing her speak of her dream left him feeling blank, as if these esoteric notions were made tangible and experiential. It forced him to contemplate his own existence in a way he had never considered before. "The next morning I woke up and I met Hiero. There he was, on the ground in my camp, looking back at me. There are no words to describe what it feels like, except that it feels like you are looking back at yourself. It is jarring, and you can't possibly prepare for it. We must have stood there for an entire day, not making a single sound, seeing through each other's eyes, and learning who we were as a single individual finally joined together, not two broken halves wandering listlessly in the world, unaware of each other's existence. I realize how silly this sounds to a Canonian, But that day I realized that there is something wrong with Sienya. We are a broken people, and most of us have no idea what it is we are missing. I tried talking about it when I returned, and was cast out and ridiculed, and I left and haven't returned since. I took up guiding Canonians through the wildlands because the wildlands became my home. There was a long moment of silent contemplation. Then Serpendis said slowly, "It seems to me that Lacranus, your Tkurai, has your people enthralled. It is like a cult. I've seen it happen in my country, a man of profound charisma upheld by his infatuated worshippers. Hells, I could have probably started one myself if I had any religious beliefs. But in your case, this soul division that you describe about your people, do you think your hermit is behind this somehow? Ancient and powerful druid that he is?" The room became heavy with solemn silence. "I do not know," she answered after a moment. "But why? Why would someone do this to a person, to a whole people? I do not understand the need to follow someone else, to believe in only what they say without thinking for myself. Only since you found Hero," Serpendis cut in, finally interrupting her for once. "Before then, what were your thoughts? Do you even remember?" "It is hard to remember," she answered. "But I do recall. I recall, in my youth, only wanting to be old enough to go on the pilgrimage. It is the most important thing for all of us to do. But then, I also secretly always had my doubts." "And after?" Serpendis said. "After Hero, it just went away," she said slowly. "And I struggled with that for a long time. I still do. I wrestle with my own shame. I feel like I have failed as a proper Sienyan. No one wants me now, not my family, my friends, my own people. I became free, and yet so completely alone." Her eyes were distant blots of darkness, staring inwardly into nothingness. Serpendis placed a bony hand on her knee and said, "You awakened, while the rest of Sienyans sleep. Your hermit, Tkurai, Lacranus, and however many other names he has in this world, he has your people coupled to him, dependent, enslaved. Your souls somehow divided and distributed among the animals of your lands, so you exist in half slumber, half awareness, and ever in need of his guidance, his love, and his presence. He set it up so that he alone validates Sienya." Piecora looked at Serpendis with an expression of imploring grief and confusion, without any answers or any means of finding them. "How do you know this much?" she asked. "How can you put all of this together so quickly?" Serpendis huffed through his nose and wrinkled the corner of his mouth as he answered, "Because I am Canonian. I am a merchant, and I am wealthy. I used to strive for power and personal gain. Your hermit and I think alike in certain ways, or perhaps I may understand his motives, or I used to before this adventure and before meeting you." "But why?" she asked loudly, breaking the silence with exasperation. "Why would he do this to people? Why would you enthrall an entire nation? What is the point?" "Many reasons," he said whimsically. He took her hand and drew on the back of it with the nail of his index finger, illustrating his points. "I might lead people into my web of charms to build a community of supplicants for only the purpose of feeding my own wealth, you see? 'Tis a very Canonian way of thinking. Or I might seek another kind of power, making policy and governing lives, and so I would bend people to my way of thinking, my authority, my rule, convincing them they are happy while never achieving more than what I allow for them." He spoke in a way that a teacher quietly explains something to a student. "But you are Sienya. You are a passionate people, bright eye and sturdy hand, the people of this land, quick to love and vengeance, the Sienyan woman and man. As the song goes, I think Tkurai made them for war." Made them? War? Are you mad? Piecora asked angrily, snapping her hand away. She stood up on her knees, threatening to assault Serpendis. He could see her muscles straining in the dim candlelight. She hurled her next words at Serpendis through seething lips and spittle. Sienia is its own bricklayer. Sienia has no enemies except our own. Land rights, insults, challenges, we fight each other constantly. No one dares to bother us, not even the Banwa, lest we unite against them. Exactly my point, Serpendis said. Piecora deflated as Serpendis watched her replay her own words in her mind, and she sunk back on her haunches. He could sense that her visceral reaction alone proved his point to her regarding the raw passion and power of the Sienian people. Piecora looked at Serpendis sternly, as if not willing to allow herself to concede the conversation over to him. Then who would— Tell me more of what you know about your hermit. Serpendis cut her off again. That's two, he thought to himself, mentally keeping score. Does he have enemies of his own? Does he have peers? Tell me of these druids. How well do they all get along? Flustered, Piecora stammered, I only know, or have heard, just here and there, of Tletres Ehifa, in your tongue, the three hierophants, the innermost circle. Tukurai is one of the three, the oldest and most powerful of the druidic community. Their community is like concentric rings. The lesser druids are further outside, and they gain access to inner rings by passing initiations, one ring at a time. The population of each ring becomes less the further inside you go, until you reach the innermost ring, Tletres Ehifa. The hermit is one of them, and from what I understand, it takes the other two to hold him in check. So, the great Lacranus rules over all druids with two peers that he is ever in contention with, Serpendis said. There is your reason for having an army at the ready, if you ask an old codger like me. I probably said too much, she said with a heavy sigh. She hopped onto her feet and left the chamber through the exit tunnel with Hiero darting after her. Serpendis decided he had been inside long enough, thinking it must have been many days that he rested inside the tree. So after bowing to Karui in a gesture of gratitude, he left the chamber and followed Piecora outside, realizing to himself that Karui sat and watched unmoving during that entire exchange. He found Piecora seated above, on a gigantic arcing tree root, draped with a curtain of dark crimson and bright jade hanging moss. Bright rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy overhead, swaying gently in the late morning's breeze. It was cool and damp on the forest floor, with soft soil and fallen leaves that cushioned one's feet. He squinted at the bright sunlight, alarmed at his lack of time awareness. Earlier, when they were talking and drinking that awful root wine, it felt to him like it might be late evening, and he was mentally ready for sleep. Looking up, he saw Hiero high above, navigating between the upper branches of the forest, chasing prey. "Got room for another passenger, milady?" asked Serpendis light-heartedly. She gestured to the soft moss next to her, inviting him, but without speaking. He climbed up and sat beside her, luxuriating in the warmth of the dry sun. "Gods, I have lost all concept of time. Is it usually this bright at midnight in the realm of the Fae?" She didn't answer, but continued picking her teeth with a small bone from her meal, while looking elsewhere into the imposing forest around them. "Tell me," he said, "Karuilavi Karupikan Kamnata, what does that translate to in Low Canonian?" That got her attention. Piecora could not hide her surprise at how fluently he said Karui's full name. "Have you been lying to us this whole time? You spoke her name perfectly. Do you actually know Banwarese?" she asked. "No, not even close. But I have a mind for such things, and I can read people. Language, behavior, they come easily to me. I am nothing if I am not an observer of people," he replied. "Black lion dancing is how you would say her full name in your common," she said. She explained to me that she actually found her animal spirit in here after she fell into the Fey world. Her pilgrimage took her into Kiahalla, which is forbidden even for her people. Nobody ever returns from the encircling forest. Even you probably know that. Ah, you speak of Cynthia and the Eldar, the Cynthians. Kiahalla is the forest that surrounds their ancient lands like a perfect ring of trees. The Undying Lands lie within this ring, and they are protected by the encircling forest, if you believe the myths. I've never met a Cynthian, never saw one. Nobody that I know has, nor anyone they know. Canonians, for the most part, believe they may have existed at one time in ancient days long gone, but not anymore, he said. Piecora replied, "We know some things about them and the encircling forest. I can tell you the Undying Lands are real, as is Kiahalla, but it is deadly, and none who enter escape." A cold feeling settled on Serpentis despite being in the sun. Wait a moment. You said she found her animal spirit in Kiahalla after she fell through to here? Are you saying that we are actually in... Yes, she interrupted. We are in Kiahalla right now, but in the Fey world, not in our world. We are in its Fey counterpart. One of the treacheries of the encircling forest is that within the forest, the veil between our world and the Fey realm is very thin on both sides, and one can never know if they wander haplessly from one world to the other. This is what happened to Karui Black Lion Dancing. She has been trapped here ever since. To her it's been only a week, but to us in our world, the primal world, over 10 years. So if we just start strolling through the forest, we could wind up back in our world? He asked excitedly. What is the concern then? It is the same concern as jumping back into the pool. We may return to our world or another world. We do not have the means to navigate our passage to our intended place or time. We could wind up at the very beginning of creation, or the very end of the world, or any point between. We could arrive at the bottom of the ocean. We could wind up in the abyss, or the hells, or the realm of shadow. There is just no way any of us can safely cross over, not without help. Serpentis sat for a while pondering this, then said, "Then we are trapped here, lost and forgotten." "Not so," Piecora replied, slapping his knee with her hand. "We are within the encircling forest, which surrounds the Undying Lands, the lands of the Eldar Cynthia. The Cynthians can help us. At least that is what Karui says." "How?" Serpentis asked incredulously. "We don't even know if they exist at all." "Karui believes they do, and her plan has been to make for the other side of the forest, the inner edge of the ring, to Cynthia. And now that we are here together, we can travel together, so it should be safer. She wants to get back home as much as we do. It's our only chance, really. And according to her, we are extremely lucky that we met like we did, at this exact place and time." The next day, they made final preparations before setting out into the forest, intending to pass through to the inner lands of Cynthia, which no human had seen for many ages. Karui spoke in Banwarisa, while Piecora translated roughly for Serpentis. "Do as I say and as I do, and go where I go." "Match my very steps," Piecora said on behalf of Karui. "This forest is as old as time itself. It exists in both realms simultaneously, and the veil between worlds is dangerously thin here. One can cross time and space and be lost forever by merely stepping beneath an arched bough, or over a stream, or behind a tree without being seen. We must constantly be looking out for each other." Karui started forward, but then stopped, turned, and spoke again. Piecora began to translate, but Serpentis held a hand up in protest. He was beginning to understand the Banwa language. "We are in a place unchanged since the world's very creation," Karui said. "Its purpose is to deal with intruders, to protect Cynthia, and that too hasn't changed. except that it has only grown darker, older, and filled with contempt. My people, who are kin to the Eldar, do not feel welcome here, so that should tell you something. It does not care for us, and it will feel no regret for killing each of us before we even see the spires of Aeonwyrm, but we must try. There is no chance of leaving this place and getting back to our loved ones. So do not be swayed by the forest. Stay focused on my steps. We only travel by day, as the nights are perilous. It is a long journey from here, so we must be ready. We must endure, and we cannot lose focus. Stay in my path. And then they were finally off, making their way deeper into the ancient forest, ducking beneath giant arching tree roots draped with carpet growths and multicolored mosses unseen in the primal world, stepping over exposed boulders caked with brightly hued lichens and weaving between ancient vines and branches the size of ship rope. Karui in the lead, followed by Serpendis, and Piecora in the back, with Hiero flying overhead as her eyes and ears. Serpendis continued to marvel at his newfound strength, energy, and clarity, despite how much he had been through in recent days or weeks. It all ran together somehow. He wondered if this explained why he so quickly learned Banwarese, a combination of time dilation and his increased mental acuity. He kept his head down and focused on Karui's every footfall with his new slippers that she fashioned for him from pieces of leather and sapling twine from the forest, even stepping into her prints and trying to match their weight and cadence. He felt utterly useless and fully dependent on his companions for survival. Losing all his treasures and returning empty-handed gnawed at him despite his recent enlightenment. It bothered him deeply that this whole adventure would potentially end at best as a complete waste of time, money, and lives, with only his own survival as compensation. He even thought about setting something up in Coast Haven to commemorate those who were lost, should he ever make it back home. Perhaps there is still time, still a chance, to find something to bring home, he thought to himself. They slowly passed through the Empyrean forest like crickets picking their way through an overgrown garden, as there was no path or established trail to follow. They carefully hopped over streams and babbling brooks on slick, exposed stones, with Karui warning them not to touch the water. They crawled over boulder fields strangled by roots and vines, and traversed over moldy, spore-ridden deadfall that made their going slow, tedious, and tiring. Many times, Karui stopped before a dark opening in a tree, or beneath a low, hanging branch, or a curtain of moss split in the middle, beckoning them to enter, or an unassuming area between two saplings, or a peculiar swath of bare ground abnormally clear of debris, only to turn aside and go far around the perceived threat, while warning with a hand gesture to keep following her. Once they came upon the remains of a rodent the size of a large dog, eviscerated by pulsing strands of white mycelia that gripped and bulged around the dead animal while feeding on it. Serpendis stood and watched in repulsed horror until Karui grabbed his hand and pulled sharply for him to continue. At times, they strode atop colossal roots soaring high over the ground that reminded Serpendis of the bridges and walkways of Vlanstrad, one of Kananaya's 7 cities, where the sun dappled the roots' thick, overlapping mosses that softened their footsteps and left faint, indented footprints behind. Sliding down one such route, they found themselves plunged into deep shade, where the temperature dropped noticeably cooler. Large fungal growths and molds grew in all directions here among the soft, rotten remains at the base of the gigantic tree that they passed beneath. Serpendis wondered how long it would be when the old, colossal tree would succumb to its failing base, and what kind of calamitous sound its inevitable crash would make. He shivered running his hands over his arms, but then felt a light, reassuring shove from Piecora behind him, compelling him to move quickly. He felt comforted knowing she was there. No one said a word that entire first day of traveling through Kiahalla, and despite the many obstacles, hazards, natural dangers, and times when Karui's unease made them change course, Serpendis felt like their journey went efficiently and easily. All along, Serpendis was aware of Hero flying overhead, flitting between the gargantuan trees and boughs with great speed and agility, constantly surveying the terrain around them. Occasionally he tried to imagine what it must be like to migrate his perception into Hero and see through his eyes, like Piecora, but each time he did so, he lost his balance and nearly fell over. As the sun slowly descended from its apex, the lower reaches of the forest grew darker and colder. Serpendis could see his breath as misty puffs with each exhale. Piecora briefly convened with Karui before quietly saying to Serpendis, through mists of her own breaths, "We're looking for a place to camp now, before it gets too dark." Her voice had a distant, muffled quality, as if the forest dampened all sounds around where they stood. The air was heavy with muted, watchful tension, and he felt exposed, as if they were on display and being observed from every angle. They continued on, as the darkness seemed to slowly overtake them from the ground up, remaining brighter in the upper canopy, but difficult to see on the floor. Until finally, Karui stopped next to an enormous fallen tree lying on its side. She and Piecora quickly set a small fire ringed with stones to hide its light, and Piecora cooked the rest of the rabbits from her earlier hunt. Hero joined them for dinner, and they ate without speaking. Night came on like an opaque presence of overbearing darkness filled with sounds that were entirely different from the daytime. Serpendis noticed that during the day, his own breathing and footfalls fully encompassed his auditory awareness, and it seemed like he and his companions were the only moving, living creatures in the forest, as if during the day the forest existed in a strange state of listless, watchful stasis. He wondered if this was due to the dual nature of the forest, and if creatures often left their current place and time unknowingly to whatever doom befell them by merely hopping or crawling or slithering or flapping across some unseen threshold. Of course, this made him also wonder what creatures were potentially entering the forest at this current place and time from places and times unimagined. At night, things became very different. Scrapes and snaps of movements along the forest floor filled his ears, as well as the occasional squeak, chirp, hum, and hiss of so many living things that came alive at night. Leathery wings beat frantically overhead, panning instantly from one side to the other. The sounds of slithering, crunching, hopping, rolling, and dragging made Serpendis try to imagine the shapes of such creatures and how they moved. Occasionally, something large crashed into the undergrowth or pushed against a tree, trembling the ground and frightening the three of them at once. When they finished their meal, Karui stood up and quipped something as if to herself, before slowly walking around the fire, each lap expanding her perimeter like a spiral. Serpendis moved out of her way several times before Piecora said to him quietly, "She's summoning our watcher for the night, and I believe some other things that may help us sleep. Don't leave the range of the fire after she does this, not for any reason, until morning, and she says it's safe." Karui roamed all the way beyond the concealed firelight, until Serpendis could barely make out her boots by the dwindling firelight. Then he heard a short whistle, and emerging overhead on top of the fallen tree came a sight that made him question his own sanity, or whether he was in a dream. A large panther, seemingly made of dim, translucent violet light, prowled into view and sat on the giant log, paying no attention to them. Serpendis scratched his eyes and blinked several times. The creature seemed to have no substance, no weight, and gave off no heat, and yet there it was, like something painted on his very retina. He dug his knuckles into his eyes, but it was still there. All of the strange and paranormal things he had witnessed recently were already too much for any sane Canonian, but somehow this moment tipped him over. He just couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Siruchinkavi," said Karui, now standing in their midst and looking at the large, ghost-lighted purple predator. Then she pointed at it. "Siru, that is his name. He will watch over us at night when we sleep." Serpendis exchanged looks with Piecora, who said as if answering his unspoken question, "Her animal spirit, the one she met here in Kiahalla, is named Siru. He will watch over us while we sleep." "I understood what she said, but—" Serpendis began. "But what? Ah, bricklayers! Isn't it time by now that you broadened your mind, Canonian?" asked Piecora, playfully mocking him. But then she stopped and studied him for a moment. He must have had a look on his face that prompted her next words. "At this moment, you are probably realizing no one will believe you when you return," she said, gesturing to Siru. "You are seeing how mysterious, how beautiful the world really is. Can I explain Siru? Not at all, except that he is Panther spirit. He belongs to Karui, and he can be anywhere and everywhere at once when called on. And he is beautiful, isn't he?" Karui lifted a branch from the ground and left the lit perimeter of the camp. A moment later, Serpendis heard the unmistakable sound of her stick dragging along the ground, passing from his left, then his right, and continuing around the outskirts of the camp. He heard her retracing her steps and caught a glimpse of her sprinkling powder from a vial. When she reached the beginning of her tracing, he heard what sounded like the ignition and ensuing sizzling of smoldering embers, and this too spread from his left to his right and traveled all the way around the ring that Karui traced in the darkness. A faint smell of burning pine needles and leaves came to Serpendis, and he could see tiny orange embers in the traced ring around their camp. Karui stepped over the tracing, joining them inside. As she snapped her fingers, the ashes all puffed around them in unison with a strong lavender odor. At once, the tracing extinguished while the odor remained within the camp. Karui gestured toward the ring she consecrated, then faced them both and said, "We are not to cross the ring. If we do, we are no longer in my protection. So long as we remain inside, we are safe and hidden from danger. We should try to get some sleep now. It's a long journey ahead," Piecora said, while lying down on her bedroll and pulling her cloak over her. She made a sound to Karui, with her mouth like clicks from a magpie bird, and Karui responded with a snort through her nose as she too lay down to sleep beside the fire. Black lion dancing, Serpendis thought to himself while looking at the ghostly violet panther on the fallen tree above him. He then wondered about how perfectly apt her name was, as translated into Low Canonian, in relation to her animal spirit. But then it bothered him. What came first? Was this her name after finding Siru, her animal spirit? Of course not, for she and Piecora were childhood friends, and Piecora always knew her as Karui, or Black Lion Dancing, long before they were reacquainted here in Kiahalla recently. And Karui only met Siru here in Kiahalla within 10 days ago, according to the counting of days here in the Fey realm. It's as if she were named according to her animal spirit, and yet that would be impossible if she only met Siru within the last 10 days. So how did anyone know to name Karui with such a name on the day she was born that so perfectly fit her animal spirit so many years before she found Siru? He laid back on his bedroll, puzzled by this conundrum, and crossed his hands behind his head while watching the darkness above. He could only make out a single star through the canopy above, and he wondered if it could also see him. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.